Okay, kids. So now it's time to start on the Eisenhower years of the 1950s, sort of the heart of the 1950s, 52 to 60. Before I talk about Eisenhower himself and some of what was going on during the period, first I want to try to help you get your head into what was going on in America. Now, we are still in the post-war era. The war ended in 45, of course. It took until 46 and 47 for really America to start to come out of the war. You had to organize. First of all, there was the occupation, right? The war ends in Europe in May of 45. It ends in Japan in technically September of 45, August of 45. And then you have to leave the soldiers in place because we don't know what's going to happen. History has not happened yet, as I keep saying. So was there going to be a rebellion in Germany against the invaders? Nobody quite knew what was going to happen. So we left a lot of troops in these places in occupation forces, both to ensure that the war didn't flare up again and to help rebuild these countries. As we talked about previously, Germany was devastated from end to end. Japan was really wiped. There was a sense, as you know from Euro and Global, most people had realized the mistake of Versailles after World War I, where they had crushed the Germans so far into the ground and sort of stamped on them economically that it had created a resentment, which then flared up into the Nazi movement that led to the Second World War. They didn't want to make that mistake again, so we wanted to help rebuild their economies. And in Europe, don't forget, we're facing 300 divisions of Russian troops. And so you had the Marshall Plan and all of that business as a way to kind of keep a hedge around the Soviet Union. Okay, and I know we've covered all that, but by the time you're getting into the late 40s, guys are starting to come home now in larger and larger numbers, being released from military. Industry is making the shift from making tanks to making cars, from making airplanes to making refrigerators. So you have a big boom in the availability of consumer products once you start to get into the 50s. You have all of that pent-up money that's sitting in the economy that had been earned and saved up, if you will, during the war. And you also have, you have the country wanting to move on, people wanting something better. People, just because it was a couple of chapters ago in the book, the Depression wasn't ancient history. All the people living in the 40s and 50s had at least been kids during the Depression, and most of them were adults during the Depression. So they wanted there was, I think, a sense that everything had been put on hold. All of the dreams of being a prosperous American had been sort of snatched from us during the Depression and then put on hold during the war, and now we wanted ours. Now we wanted that good life that we had always been told as Americans we were kind of owed and expected. And as a result of that, one of the results of that, that coupled with the GI Bill, as I talked about last time, was this explosive growth in the suburbs. Americans up to that point had been migrating from the farms into the cities, and then as you hit about 1910, you start to see suburban growth rise up to about 1930, and urban growth decline to about 1930. Now, again, I try use your AP thinking. What do you think is going on in that period that's causing that? Now think a minute. First of all, you have the invention of the automobile, which makes it possible, if you have a job in Manhattan, you no longer have to live in Manhattan and hop in the subway, or maybe live in downtown Brooklyn. Now you can live out on Long Island someplace and drive your car either to Manhattan or drive it to the local train station. You have a growth of commuter rail here down to the Long Island Railroad and take the train into the city. And that was true in a lot of cities in America. You didn't have to live within walking distance of your job anymore. You didn't even have to live within a trolley ride. You had trolleys in the cities, or within a subway ride if you were in New York or Chicago that had places that had subways. Boston had the MTA. You could live farther out of town and either drive into work or drive from your home to the end of your commuter rail system. So that allowed there to be a lot of growth here. You also had during the 20s, of course, prosperity, which made people... Americans have always longed for... We remember we talked about Turner's thesis about the frontier. It's not technically part of Turner's thesis, but sort of built into it is the idea of the homestead. And I've mentioned this in class too. Many of you have been to Europe, and you know that people in Europe tend to live differently, because living in a city or a town, those are ancient cities over there. So that's kind of built into their mentality. And a home for them is a townhouse. In America, since the days of Jamestown, we've had this vision that home should be an acre of land and your own personal house in the middle of it, and anything less than that is sort of a compromise or a temporary position. So having an apartment in the city is kind of, well, you've put the real house on hold, or you've decided to forego that for some reason. But normal, quote normal, in American mind is your own plot of land, your own estate, your own acreage with a house in the middle of it. And that goes back to the settlers. It goes back to the Homestead Act of the last century and the frontier pioneers. So there's this drive in America for land. You notice it even on Staten Island. The growth on Staten Island has been astronomical, even since I was a kid. I can tell you when I was growing up, Staten Island's population was half of what it is now, and the condos and townhouses, there weren't any of those. You didn't see any of those. But when they started building those, if you notice, all of them have little backyards to them. Because even if you've got a little, 15, 20-foot frontage condo, you have to have that back patio because that's your little estate. Well, all of that gets put on hold, of course, 30 to 40, because you're dealing with the Depression, and nobody's got the money to be moving around much. In fact, this is just urban, suburban. If you looked at... If we had real rural into this too, you'd see a lot of people moving off the farms as they tried to escape things like the Dust Bowl and the collapse of farm prices. After the war, this goes on this steep. Look at the steepness of that slope there. This steep upward curve, and urban life declines. Why? Well, you have now cars more available, and everybody's buying a car. And the government, federal government, is building highways like crazy. In 56, for instance, roughly around here, the federal government passed the Federal Highway Act of 1956. Notice it, $25 billion, which meant a lot more then than it does now, even. But $25 billion to build what's now called the Eisenhower Interstate Highway System. 40,000 miles of interstate highways. Before this, you had the U.S. system. Starting in the 1920s and 30s, really, we had started building interstate roads. Before that, you had county roads and state roads, and the state roads connected up to some degree, but there wasn't really a good national system. It was really a mishmash and a hodgepodge, and you really needed to know your way around a map if you were going to drive across country. 20s and 30s, you build the U.S. system. So famously, you have US 1. US 1 runs is also called in some places the Boston Post Road. It was the old road that ran from Philadelphia to Boston to carry the mail on, which is why the U.S. government got involved in improving it early on. That was extended, so it ran. The U.S. 1 runs all the way from Maine, on the border with Canada, to the tip of Florida, and even technically onto the Florida Keys. So it runs down the whole length of the East Coast. That's terrific, right? Except you're looking at a picture there of US 1. As it passes through the District of Columbia, you're going through town with intersections and traffic lights. That's the start of US 1 in the south. You start at the Florida Keys, and that's the mile marker in Florida, and that is technically the beginning of US 1 as you're facing north. And that's the northern terminus of US 1. You're facing south, that's up in Maine. And if you take a turn that way, you're in New Brunswick in Canada. Okay, now, so that's very cute and quaint and all that, but so this is a rough map of the old U.S. route system, which still exists. The roads are still out there. Ignore the colors on this. This is US 31, which changed its route at a certain point. But this is what the system looked like, and you can see, it does cross large parts of the country, but it's all those kinds of roads like I just showed you. You see, you have a replacement system here for what we now call the Eisenhower system. And notice the National System of Interstate and Defense Highways. These are the I routes. So I-95, I-87, etc. Those are the interstate system. And as the name on this old map shows, the system of interstate and defense highways, part of the argument for building this highway system was what would happen if the Russians invaded us? We would need to have a system of roads built to correct specifications so that they were heavy enough to carry things like tanks, and be able to move quickly from top to bottom and back and forth across the country, all up and down the coasts. When you combine those two systems, therefore, you now had this vast and extensive network of interstate roads, the I-95, that's the red and the blue signs that you see on the highway, the U.S. routes, those are the ones that have the white signs on them, and this makes the world much more accessible to a car. And as you can see, the interstate system, this is one interchange here, was far more extensive, far more complicated to build, and provide all sorts of bizarre interconnections. This is just a single interchange. This is a particularly complicated one. But You can see that the elevated highways, so that you're off city streets, you're not dealing with cameras and local government. The system is set up with alternatives so that you can avoid the big cities if you want to and go around them to avoid city traffic and so on. In any event, the highway system and the larger availability of cars make this sort of thing possible. And this is one of the many Levittowns that there were out there. Levittown, Long Island, and there's Levittown outside of Philadelphia, were the brainchild of the Levitt Company, which had actually been started back in the 20s, and the idea was planned communities, which was a new thing. Prior to that, nobody did a lot of planning. People just bought property and you built a house, and if they were building another road, you bought land along it and you tried to build houses and you tried to extend them. Abraham Levitt came up with the idea of, what if we sat down and actually planned out a community where we were going to put every house in it, where we were going to put the schools, where we were going to have the shopping centers, and so on. After the war, really, though, from 47 on, this becomes the way things are done. Building of mass suburbs like this, and Levittowns become something of a joke. But in fact, Levitt was doing on this vast scale what was being done on smaller scales as well. We do this even now. On Staten Island, if a big builder buys 2 or 3 acres, they will plan this community, build all the houses, and then go to sell them. That had been being done again since the 20s, but not with the level of planning involved. And why are people coming out to these things to buy these? To have this. This is your what's called a Cape Cod style house. And this is what people were going for. Folks who had been living in cramped apartments in Brooklyn and Queens now had the opportunity to buy their own house with their own front yard and their own backyard and start living that suburban American life. Well, with the development of the suburb comes a bunch of other things that are part of this, but not directly. They're not caused by this. Well, they're intertwined with it. Let's say it that way. So, as we said, the GI Bill had provided loans to returning servicemen to make it possible for them to get mortgages, cheap mortgages, to buy these things. Not to buy other stuff. I mean, they couldn't buy cars, or that sort of thing. But they could get a mortgage to buy a house. They could also get loans to start businesses, to buy a farm and start a farming business, as well as we said, to pay the cost of tuition and of living expenses to go to college. So with all of this going on, you have this boom in prosperity. The gross national product, we talked about what that is, gross domestic product of the United States, went from about $200 billion in 1945 all the way up to $500 billion by 1960, in 15 years, so more than doubled, and which was huge. And Americans really became a consumer culture. During that time, we only had 6% of the world's population, but we had 3/4 of the world's cars, and were eating up about half of the other products produced in the world. So the consumer culture takes off here. You also have the baby boom. you guys may have heard about this. Um, these guys are coming back from war. They have not been home for 2, 3, 4, 5 years in some cases. These young women who were working in defense industries of various kinds are coming of age. And what's the first thing they want to do? Everybody starts looking around. They've got some money. They have the opportunity, they know, to buy a home, time to get married. And so a lot of the marriages that had been delayed because of the war itself, and who knows, perhaps as a result to some degree of the tail end of the Depression, suddenly start happening. And so you have, and people who are already married now feel confident enough of their economics to have more kids. So what happens around 47, 48, 49, 50 is this massive increase in childbirth. Part of it because you have, as I said, a 5, 6, 7 year sort of pent-up market, if you will, for marriage that all happens all at once. Instead of being spread out over 7 years, it all happens kind of all together. And then once people are married, and even as people get married into the 50s, they're not worried about where the next meal is coming from. Everything looks great. Everything looks rosy. The economy's doing great. And so people have a bunch of kids. And, nowadays, families have a kid, 2 kids, sometimes 3. Back then, a 4 or 5 kid family was not at all unusual and was kind of the common thing. The average age of marriage also drops. The average age of marriage went up during the Depression and dropped afterwards, again, as people stopped postponing. So not only are more people getting married sort of all at once there, but you also have lower marriage age, and that gives you more time to have kids. If you get married when you're 30 or older, you don't have that many years. If you're getting married at 20 and 22, there's an extra few kids built in there. So from the end of the war and the baby boom era, as it's called, is generally counted by demographers, guys who study these population statistics, as starting in 46 with the end of the war and running to about 64. And that's really when you hit the peak. That affects people's mentality too. So you have this new, remember we talked about the cult of domesticity. You have this sort of renewal of the cult of domesticity. Because you have more kids and women are getting married young, by the time you get to 1960, which is at the end of the period we're talking about in this particular moment, 3/4 of women between 20 and 24 were married. So think about that. Think about anybody you know who's been married lately, and then think about the fact that if you were a woman, you by the time you would have been out of college, and not all women went to college, of course, and not all of them finished college. They might go for a couple of years. But if you think of it in terms of your experience, generally you graduate from college at 22. So if you were not married by the time you were 24, 2 years out of college, you were in the 1/4 minority. So all these women were getting married young, and as I said, they were having lots of kids. If you think about that, society then starts to encourage this view that women should have of themselves as the ultimate homemakers. Why? Because, and I'm not saying right or wrong, but, the perception was you needed that. You needed somebody at home to take care of the kids. You needed somebody to look after the house and all of the stuff that goes on there. And so where you had this up and down and women starting to enter the workforce, and certainly during World War II, you had this big boom in women going out and being in the workforce. Now all of the signals that women get from culture are the ultimate woman is the ultimate mom, the ultimate homemaker. And so I don't know if you guys, what you guys watch on TV, but there must be episodes online someplace if you've never seen it. But instructive to watch are the television shows of the era. The most famous of it, Leave It to Beaver. Beaver was a kid, and it's a sitcom about his family. He's got an older brother and mom and dad, and of course, little Beaver always does dumb things and gets caught, and dad gives him a good talking to, and all of that. Other shows from the era, things like Father Knows Best, Ozzie and Harriet. These are domestic sitcoms. They're all about families. And okay, so they're dumb sitcoms, but what dumb sitcoms do is reflect back to us what we think or expect, or what people watching them think, well, I have to be that. I don't want to get too off, waste your time too much, but I'll just tell you, a lot of you have probably seen the movie Animal House. Before, when I was a kid, Animal House had not yet come out, and once it did, that's what kids thought college should be. And so when they got to college, that's how they acted. So that movie about a bunch of really disgusting frat guys, there were people like that in real life, but not that many of them. By the time I got to college, there were a ton of them because they had seen that movie and said, oh, well, I guess that's what this is supposed to be. A lot of people saw those sitcoms, Leave It to Beaver and Fathers Know Best, and Ozzie and Harriet, and the Donna Reed Show, and Patty Duke, and you can name 100 of these things. And they looked at that and said, I guess that's what I'm supposed to be. Okay, so what are you supposed to be? Well, all of these shows had at their heart, first of all, what we call now a nuclear family. Has nothing to do with atomic energy, but it means an intact family. There's a mother, there's a father, who clearly love each other, and there's not a thought, the word divorce never gets mentioned. There are at least 2, often 3 kids, because you don't want to have too many because it makes the plot too complicated, but you don't want to have too few. Dad always has a job, usually is something relatively respectable. Dad sits around on weekends wearing a tie at home. I kid you not. Mom is always available, always home. Dad is wise, but doesn't always get the kids. Mom is really sharp and seems like she doesn't get them, but really in the end, she's always the smart one. Mom always cooks all of everybody's meals. Everybody always sits at home. Dinner time is sacred, and they sit around the table having pleasant discussions about things. The parents are always firm, but loving and flexible. The kids never do anything seriously wrong. This is the picture, and the mother never has a job, not even considered. She always stays at home and is the homemaker. Interestingly, even in sitcoms that were not quite that way, you must have seen at some point, some of you, The Honeymooners. The Honeymooners is one of the great pieces of American television. It's a stupid little sitcom, but it's really cleverly written. Jackie Gleason, this is. Even there, what you're presented there with is the picture of an American family. And there's Jackie Gleason, bus driver, so he's a blue-collar working guy. and he lives in an apartment in Bensonhurst. That's what made that series a little bit unique at the time. It wasn't about relatively prosperous people in the suburbs. It was about a working class guy still living in the city. But he lives in this apartment with his wife, Alice. They don't have any kids. And yet Alice is a housewife. She doesn't go out to work. She doesn't have a job. She just stays at home all day and does the cooking and the cleaning and all of that. That's what was presented to American women as the ideal. And even in, as I said, The Honeymoon was a very interesting show. Even in those few sitcom episodes where Alice, for one reason or another, has to go get a job, at the end of the sitcom, she's always sort of proven to dumb old Ralph that she can do it, but then she chooses not to. You know, the end of the sitcom is always, see, she's just as good as a guy, and she can hold a job too, and she's just as competent, and Ralph ought to respect that. But at the end of it, she decides we're all better off if she just stays at home. It's a very powerful message that people got. So Mom's job was to be very involved with the kids, go to the PTA meetings, go to the Little League games, keep the house clean, get everybody's meals cooked, and support Dad. And Dad's job was to go out to the city and make the money that was going to support this lifestyle. On the other hand, women therefore became, and this is sometimes missed by people, women became powerful consumers. It was the mom who made the decision about a lot of those purchases. She was the one who was going to the new phenomenon called supermarkets. No longer neighborhood grocery stores, but the larger supermarkets. That's why, if you look at daytime television in the 50s, daytime and even evening television in the 50s, it's the advertising is all pitched at the women. They're the one who are going to go out and buy these products. They're the ones who are making these choices. The men would make the choices ultimately about things like cars. And so the car ads were always pitched at guys. But when it came to food, clothing, everything, soap, that's where the word soap opera comes from, because all of the soap, the daytime dramas were sponsored by manufacturers of hand soap, hand cream, laundry soap and detergent, bleach, all that kind of stuff, always pitched at women because they were the ones making all of those nitty-gritty economic decisions. Again, the big stuff was often big ticket items like cars. Often Dad, stepped in and he was going to take control of this. But when it was where are we going to have dinner or what we going to have for dinner, is it time for the kids to get clothes? All the stuff that Mom would use. So consumer items like refrigerators, stoves and cooktops and ranges and all that. Those kinds of items, furniture, interior decoration, that was all women making those choices. So this also gave them a lot of economic power. Which, by the way, also highlights, again, the influence of television is having. Television is now, by the 50s, the new huge mass media. Everybody watches it, and television advertising really becomes the driver of the economy. Okay. Now, it does not mean that this period of the 50s was without its social critics. That Levittown mentality did upset a lot of people. There's a famous song. I won't play it because I don't think the audio when I do that comes through on here, but you can look it up again. I'm sure it's all over YouTube. It's a little bit late for the period. 1962 the song comes out by Malvina Reynolds, called Little Boxes. And the song, I urge you to look it up and listen to it at some point. Little boxes on the hillside, little boxes made of ticky-tacky, little boxes on the hillside, little boxes all the same. There's a pink one, and a green one, and a yellow one, and a blue one, and little boxes on the hillside, and they're all just the same. And the song goes on, you can listen to it, to talk about the people in the boxes, and how all the people in the boxes are exactly the same. And the boys goes off to university, and then they go into business, and the girls go and they get married, and they send the kids off to the school, where in the school all the kids are taught to be just the same. And there's a intense pressure for conformity to this vision. There is, I forget if they mentioned in your book, but there's a great novel of the period called The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit. A guy named Sloan Wilson wrote it. The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, and it was made into a movie actually with Gregory Peck, and it's not a bad movie. The book is more powerful, but it's not a bad movie. But The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit is about one of these young couples who are part of this middle class, this new prosperous middle class, and living in the suburbs, guy working in the city, and all that they're expected to do, and what the woman is expected to be part of, and the social life she's expected to have, and how she's expected to behave with the other wives, pressed on her by the other wives, and how he has to act at work. And there's a line in the book where the main character, a guy named Tom Rath, says, "All I could see was a lot of bright young men in flannel suits rushing around New York in a frantic parade to nowhere." And then he looks on at himself and sees he's one of the men in the gray flannel suits too. Everybody's expected to be exactly the same. There's a William White, W-H-Y-T-E, wrote a great book called The Organization Man, which was a book of social psychology about how the new corporate structure in America, these guys all working in their gray flannel suits for these huge American prosperous corporations, and having constantly thrown at them that you have to be part of the team, and you have to be a team player, and you have to be a company man, they were losing their identities, and their conformity was sort of destroying their humanity. And let me point out, these guys were talking from the inside. White was a reporter who knew what he was reporting on. Sloan Wilson was a Harvard grad and had worked as a reporter himself, and had served in the military. These guys, they knew they'd had the same experience as the men that they were writing about, and they saw it. I should also point out, if you're fans of movies, Sloan Wilson wrote really two novels for which he's famous. The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit is one. The other one is a novel called The Summer Place, which is not as it is actually as relevant in its own way. The Summer Place was also made into one of the great American movies, and it's about a couple of kids, teenagers, who go away with their folks to a summer resort up in Maine. That was the place in those days that people would go to get away from the heat, and you had these very fancy, classy resort towns and like that up there. These two kids go off with their families, they meet each other, they fall in love. It's kind of the anti-Romeo and Juliet story. They fall in love. Their families are very different social backgrounds, and so in the hyper-conforming 1950s of America, they can't get married. So they go off their own way, and they each marry different people. They don't take the Romeo and Juliet choice. And then they come back together and rediscover each other years later. It's an interesting book on a sort of deeper psychological level than The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit is, about what the 50s were like. Anyway, you had these social science types like William White with The Organization Man, Daniel Riesman, The Lonely Crowd, who sort of took the opposite view from White. If White's idea was that The Organization Man was having his conformity was destroying him, Riesman's idea was that the corporate culture was making him self-forgetful and outwardly directed. Who cooperated better. So, that's an interesting thing. If it were to come up on the AP, you could actually make an interesting case, I think. On the one hand, corporate culture of the time and the 50s conformity, people lost their individualism, but on the other hand, it made them more able to cooperate. I'm not taking sides onto which is better, but it's two edges of the same sword. Well, that's more very intellectual kind of critique of the period. But you also had a literary and artistic rebellion against conformity. This here is Jack Kerouac. Jack Kerouac is one of those guys that you could have an entire semester or year or degree studying, along with all of his friends. Kerouac, along with William S. Burroughs, Neil Cassady, that's Cassady, and Allen Ginsberg, and Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and on, formed a group that came to, that gave themselves really the name of the Beats. And because they were viewed as being lefty and commie sympathizers, they were called by other people sometimes beatniks, because that somehow made it sound Russian, I guess. Anyway, the Beats were poets, novelists, writers, artists, jazz musicians that explored nonconformity. Kerouac was a brilliant guy, but couldn't hold down a steady job, couldn't hold down a degree, and kicked around America having kind of adventures and writing works that didn't conform with any literary form. His most famous work is On the Road. And On the Road is it's just the story of him taking a long road trip with Neil Cassady and some other people, running into various folks and sort of their wild adventures, but it's more the power of his use of words that gets people excited. One of the most famous road, Kerouac writes, "The only people for me are the mad ones, the ones mad to live, mad to talk, mad to be saved, desirous of everything at the same time, the ones who never yawn or say a commonplace thing, but burn, burn, burn like fabulous Roman candles, exploding like spiders across the stars, and in the middle you can see the blue center light pop, and everybody goes, aw." Now that's powerful, brilliant writing and use of words. Energy. Whereas Kerouac was something of a novelist, and I should point out that he was also Kerouac is a fascinating character. You can go on and on about him, but he got involved later in life with Buddhism, which would cause a whole movement among young nonconformist types in poetry and the arts into Buddhism. And that really, it's funny because Kerouac's works are really thick with Catholic spirituality, not in the traditional sense, but Catholic sensibilities. But then he discovers Buddhism, and so you have this whole layer of Tantric Buddhism kind of mixed into it. The guy you're looking at here is a poet of the period, friend of Kerouac, named Allen Ginsberg. Ginsberg lived a long time, and so he later grew a beard and got even wilder looking. But he was another one. These were brilliant guys. I mean, Ginsberg was kicked out of Columbia University, really. They were all geniuses, but very eccentric geniuses. One of Ginsberg's most famous works, probably his most famous work, is a long poem called Howl, which begins famously, "I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn, looking for an angry fix. Angel-headed hipsters, burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo in the machinery of night, who poverty and tatters and hollow-eyed and high sat up smoking in the supernatural darkness of cold water flats floating across the tops of cities, contemplating jazz, who bared their brains to heaven under the L and saw Mohammedan angels staggering on tenement roofs illuminated, who passed through universities with radiant cool eyes, hallucinating Arkansas and Blake Light's tragedy among the scholars of war." The poem goes on that way. And you can see, first of all, a fearlessness in talking about everything from drug use to alternative religions. You can see him capturing not just Kerouac, but all the people around them, the angel-headed hipsters, burning for the ancient heavenly connection. This powerful longing all of them had to rediscover an authentic spirituality through poetry, but certainly in complete nonconformity with the world around them. All of these guys got arrested multiple times. One of them was involved with a murder, which is how Ginsberg got in trouble at Columbia. They were sexual nonconformists, among other things. The Beats tended to live in poverty and in crappy neighborhoods where they would have cold water flats, as they were called, apartments where you didn't actually get hot water. This was kind of what they were about. The Beats had two main centers of operation. One was in New York City, particularly around Greenwich Village. Greenwich Village on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. At now, you have to be a gazillionaire to be able to afford to live there. But back at the time, Greenwich Village was a rundown, falling apart, seedy, semi-dangerous neighborhood of the city with lots of small apartments that were rented really cheaply. And so Greenwich Village for decades had been packed full of starving artists, literally, artists who could barely make a buck to keep soul and body together, writers, poets, kids, teenagers looking to discover themselves, scholars. It was the nonconformist neighborhood, and on the West Coast it was San Francisco, which certain neighborhoods of San Francisco were that way as well, and they congregated around certain individual bookshops. I won't go into. We could spend all day on this, but you can go look it up if you're interested in this sort of thing. There were a couple of bookshops that were the center of where they operated from, and the coffee houses became the thing at the time. So instead of going out to the bar, you'd go down to this coffee house where you would have poetry readings, jazz musician, progressive jazz musicians, readings from whatever work anybody was working on. They would sit around drinking coffee and sometimes other things, and had their own sort of underground cultural movement, because a lot of what they were doing was not just frowned upon by society, but was actually illegal. Public performances of poetry that had dirty words in it, for instance, was considered obscenity, and you could be arrested for it, and some of them were. But they loved that. They ate up being these sort of rebels. I don't want to make too much of the Beat folks, because they were a very tiny group in America. They were famous. People loved to talk about them. And high school and college kids were great admirers of theirs in many cases, because they wished they could be as sort of nonconformist and free as them. But it's not like they were profoundly influential in the suburbs. I just urge you to make sure that you have heard of Kerouac, that you've heard of On the Road, you know what was basically up with them, and that you can identify Riesman and White that I talked about before, and Sloan. Yeah. I should also point out, I guess, one of the artists, visual artists, who's sort of key for the period. And this is a guy who's so influential in art that he becomes sort of the symbol of everything everybody loves and hates about, quote, modern art. That's a painting there called Lavender Mist by Jackson Pollock. Jackson Pollock was an artist of the 50s, again, a very nonconformist type. Loved to get into trouble, alcoholic, real pain in the neck as a human being, but was trying to break through the conformity of the period, to break through all the forms of art that had existed before. We were now living in a world where there was movies and television and photography. So what was visual art for? It wasn't portrait painting anymore, and you had moving pictures. So cubism, which is trying to show the same object from many different angles simultaneously, didn't necessarily seem to be relevant to Pollock. So Pollock is saying, well, what do we do? What can we do? How do I express through art? And there is Pollock at work, and you can see what he does. He drips paint on the canvas, he pours it, he splotches it. It looks like it's just ridiculous splatter, but in fact it's not. It is it's very controlled. Pollock knew what he was doing. When he composed these paintings, they aren't just mere random splashes. He has a purpose in what he does. This is one of his most famous, one of his earliest, called Autumn Rhythm. And, you know, I've shown you one before, and you can see, just for instance, he's choosing a color palette. This sort of black, there's a hint of green in that black. The beige kind of color here, the white, on that natural canvas background. And it may look like splatter, but there is, if you take time to contemplate it, and this is the kind of art that really you can't just glance at and move on. You have to take time to sort of really sit before it and contemplate it, see it in person. There's a rhythm and a movement. Even though it's a static canvas, obviously, he's expressing a kind of energy. He's expressing a kind of movement and a kind of power. you can think of it sort of like a progressive jazz music performance put on canvas. This is another piece by Pollock, which is simply entitled Number 18, which is clearly very different from Autumn Rhythm. It's there's a different color palette here. There's a different density, the amount, if you will, of squiggles, if you want, on the canvas. The background is different. He's using a much grayer undercoat than the sort of khaki color on the other one. So there are differences in these paintings, but they really require a lot of tuning in. He's an abstract expressionist, so it's abstract. There's no actual object being depicted, but he's trying to express emotion. When I talk about this with kids, usually I try to put it in terms of something like music. When you listen to a great Beethoven symphony, no words, it's not, Beethoven is not trying to imitate the sounds of nature. You know, you're not hearing a bird tweeting in the forest or something. He's not trying to give you something to dance to. He's not trying to give you something to put words to. The music, if you just sit and you let it absorb it, it communicates directly an emotion. Fear, tension, power, joy, whatever it is. Pollock is trying to do the same thing with these canvases, to communicate sometimes very complex feelings, emotions, senses of things without using a specific object. Yeah, it's not Van Gogh showing you crows in a wheat field and giving you a sort of wistful sense from that. He's trying to communicate the feeling or the emotion directly. You may or may not like Pollock's painting. I'm not saying you have to. There are a lot of people who hate his stuff, and certainly he became the target of parody and became one of the reasons why so many people simply dismiss his work as being just, my 5-year-old could do that kind of thing. But he was, whatever you think of him, he was absolutely representative of the period. And that piece, Autumn Rhythm, is really the most famous of his works, the most sort of archetypical of Pollock's works. He was not the only guy who was doing work in this period. I've mentioned to you Edward Hopper before. Hopper was continuing to work into the 1950s. Again, as I mentioned to you last time I talked about him, portraying the loneliness and alienation of the city. He continues that. Okay. Well, most people, including most young people, did not go to the kinds of museums or galleries or exhibitions that Pollock's paintings were shown at. Although they had their own movement, the Beats, most Americans did not go to the coffee houses or buy the poems and the limited editions through the trendy little bookstores. That would have been Ginsberg and Kerouac's work. Most Americans indulge in pop culture, and here, of course, is an early picture of the king himself with his trademark sneer, Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley has been studied to death. I'm sure you're familiar with him. But of course, he really did start as a poor kid, grew up really deprived, but made something of himself. He was a truck driver who walked into Sun Records in Memphis and was picked up. Now, one of the interesting things about Elvis was how black he was. No, he wasn't black himself, but he was really a powerful example of the crossover of putting black music into the hands of white teenagers. He started off at Sun Records, and Sun Records really was famous for its making of black stars. Rock and roll, particularly the original rock and roll that Presley was famous for, was based on African American rhythms and sounds, the songs that were common to them, the rhythm, and it really grew out of rhythm and blues, which was a black form of expression going back with its roots in jazz. So that too is an entire 4-year study of the history of American music and how it all happened. But briefly, you're familiar, I'm sure, with the Elvis phenomenon. He was as big a phenomenon as you think he was. He was monster in the 50s and into the 60s. Because he was something new. Before that, before Elvis comes along, and the people with Elvis, Jerry Lee Lewis, and we'll talk about the DJs in a minute. Pop music, American pop music, was really safe, cutesy tunes, stuff that mom and dad would be perfectly comfortable with. Nothing threatening, nothing wild, nothing overly emotional, sappy, sweet love songs, but nothing, too deep, cute little novelty numbers. So when the rock and roll scene began to emerge, it was a real challenge to the status quo. Elvis's music was all first of all, black derived, which made some people uncomfortable. Second, very intended to stir up emotion. You were supposed to get a little wild listening to him and start jumping around and getting really into the rhythm. Famously, of course, were Elvis's hips. He danced on stage in what we would look at today as nobody would even notice, it seems, when somebody tells you that Elvis was only shown from the waist up on national television because his hips were too sexually suggestive, if you see the films of him full length, you sit there trying to figure out what was so bad about what they were looking at, but it really spooked people. The sneer, there was a sort of raw sex appeal to Elvis that drove teenagers crazy, but also made a lot of other people very uncomfortable and worried about this explosion of emotion. The American music market at the time was driven largely by the great DJs. There were a whole ton of them out there, but the biggest and most important of them was this guy, Alan Freed. Now, Alan Freed may look like the geekiest guy on the planet, but in fact, teenagers loved him, ate him up. He started off in Cleveland, where he was the guy who invented the term rock and roll to describe this new kind of rhythm and blues records that were coming out of the black community, and then often you had cover versions being done by white artists. And Freed was playing all of this stuff on the radio, and he started calling it rock and roll. And he became the big promoter of a lot of these artists. He put on shows in New York, would hire out the biggest theaters in New York, particularly over school breaks. So his Christmas shows and his Easter vacation shows were, immense. And if you know anything about the history of rock and roll music from the 50s in particular, everybody who's anybody you've ever heard of, was made big by Alan Freed, and he had them on his program, on his stage shows. I'm trying to say, and then made a number of movies. They were low budget pictures. They were really just excuses to put artists on film. So, you know, there would be some crazy plot about, trying to, I don't know, raise money to put up the school or whatever it was, there was some plot nobody cared about, which was really just an excuse for him to be introducing act after act after act of all of your favorite artists. And the idols of the period, some of them now completely forgotten. The Penguins, the Harptones, some of these guys. He discovered these one-hit wonders, but he also, guys like Fats Domino and Frankie Lyman, who were big deals at the time, all of these big artists went through Alan Freed. There were others around too, Murray the K. Kaufman in New York, and eventually guys like Cousin Brucey would come along. But this is the culture that most people experienced. This was happening for a couple of reasons. One, because, well, there were a lot of reasons for it. One of which was because in the 50s you had the transistor invented. Okay, so what? Before that time, a radio, and if you need me to explain the physics of how a transistor works, I'll do it. Please contact me. I'll be happy to. But briefly, radios before that time used tubes, vacuum tubes. They look like small light bulbs, and inside are a series of electrical components called plates and grids that you used to take radio waves and turn them into sound. And these things, these tubes, ranged in size from maybe an inch big to 2 or 3 inches big. And so a radio was the size of a small, the smallest you could get a radio was the size of maybe a shoebox. And it had to be plugged in. You needed a lot of power to run one. And so it was very difficult, almost impossible, to have portable radios. There were such things as portable radios. You had them in things like police cars, but they were very difficult and they were easy to break, and they were not in the grasp of the average person. 1950s, William Shockley and others invent the transistor, which instead of then using one of these vacuum tubes, now all you need is something that is the size of, quarter the size of your fingernail. And you didn't need a lot of power. So you could now make a radio the size of a a little bit bigger than your hand, and run it on batteries, which meant radio was now portable. You could take it with you anywhere. And so kids could bebop down the street with a radio on their ear. They could take it to the beach with them. They could, take it to school with them. You could have real good workable radios in your cars, better than the radios that had existed in cars, and so it was. It became more feasible then for kids to have more access to music, and it made their appetites insatiable. So you had to fill the airtime with stuff. You also had advances in electronics that made record players more cheaper and more available. So again, record players to that time had been good record players, had been rather large affairs and bulky and a pain in the neck. Now you had small portable record players. They were still, the size of a small suitcase, but they were affordable to a kid, and you could carry them from place to place. So you'd take it over to your friend's house after school, and you had the 45, the single. So one song on one side, and then the B side, another song on the other side. So all of a sudden, you also had technology making music more generally available to people, and kids really getting into this music scene in a way that they hadn't before. Well, kids always like to rebel. They always like to find ways to tick off their parents. And so if you condemn a guy like Elvis Presley as his music being dangerous and lascivious and this and that, that's the quickest way to make him into a national hero, which is exactly what happened. And it's interesting. I'm going to talk to you next time about the civil rights movement. Kids then also wanted the real thing, if you will. And instead of listening to Pat Boone, a white as fresh milk performer performing a cover of some black guy's record and doing it in a tame and toned down and calmed down way, they wanted to hear Chuck Berry or Fats Domino or some of these other black performers do it the real, authentic, wild and whoopin' way and right out of their own mouths. So you had a lot of white kids listening to black music, and that was also, threatening to a lot of people. So this became the way that teenagers rebelled in the 50s. Okay, I'm going to leave that there, and I'm going to pick up next time with the rest of Eisenhower, and then we'll talk about the civil rights movement after that.